The hum was the first thing I fell in love with. Not the pristine, tree-lined streets of Summit Ridge, nor the spacious, architect-designed house that was now mine. It was the low, steady hum of electronics, the quiet symphony of cooling fans, server racks, and precisely calibrated instruments that filled the small, detached structure at the back of my property. To most, it would have been a guest cabin or a pool house. To me, it was the sanctuary, the nerve center, the one place on Earth where the chaotic noise of the world resolved into the clean, orderly logic of data and signals. My life had been a long one, spent in the roaring heart of that chaos. 40 years in Washington, D.C., watching the architecture of our world shift from analog to digital, and then dedicating my every waking hour to protecting the fragile infrastructure that held it all together. Now, I was retired, a widower. My wife, Sarah, had been the one to find this place. "You need a quiet place for your noisy hobby, Alex," she'd said, smiling, just weeks before the diagnosis that would rewrite my future into a solo act. The hobby, amateur radio, was my cover story. It was a plausible, relatable reason for the sophisticated antenna array I was planning, and for the hours I would spend in my shack. The truth was, my retirement was conditional. I was still a consultant, a quiet node in a network designed to listen for the faint whispers of digital threats to the nation's critical infrastructure. The cabin wasn't a hobby shed. It was my listening post. The structure itself was unique. From the outside, it was a simple, windowless building with a reinforced steel door. Inside, it was a different world. A professionally installed Faraday cage was woven into the walls, shielding it from electromagnetic interference. It had its own dedicated, triple redundant power supply, and a direct, armored fiber optic line that I had paid a small fortune to have run from the main trunk. The lock on the door wasn't a deadbolt. It was a biometric scanner that read my fingerprint and retina. It was, in the parlance of my old world, a sensitive compartmented information facility, or SIF, a black box, a vault. I had just finished calibrating a new multi-band directional antenna, a sleek but complex piece of equipment mounted on a discrete mast in my backyard. When she made her first appearance, she seemed to materialize at the edge of my perfectly manicured lawn, a woman whose entire being radiated an aura of officious disapproval. She was the platonic ideal of the suburban matriarch of order, a crisp pastel polo shirt, blindingly white capri pants, and a visor perched atop a helmet of immaculately coiffed, unnaturally blonde hair. She held a clipboard, the universal scepter of her kind. "You must be Alex Thorne," she said. It was not a question, but a statement of fact, as if she were a biologist identifying a new and possibly invasive species. "That's me," I said, offering a neighborly smile that felt rusty from disuse. "And you are?" "Marge Thompson. I'm the president of the Summit Ridge Homeowners Association." Her eyes, small and sharp, were not on me. They were fixed on the antenna. Her expression, a mixture of confusion and disgust, the way one might look at a piece of unidentifiable modern art. "And what, exactly, is that thing?" "That," I said, still smiling, "is a Step IR DB18. It's a directional Yagi antenna for my amateur radio hobby." "Amateur radio," she repeated, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "It looks like a piece of industrial scrap metal. It's an eyesore, and it is most certainly not in compliance with the Summit Ridge aesthetic guidelines." "Actually," I countered gently, "I believe it is. I reviewed the CC&Rs before installation. They restrict satellite dishes over a certain size, but per the federal OTARD rule, they can't legally prohibit the installation of antennas for amateur radio operations. I have my FCC license if you'd like to see it." The mention of a federal rule, of a reality outside the hermetically sealed bubble of her authority, caused a flicker of something dark and angry in her eyes. She was not accustomed to being contradicted, especially not with facts. "The rules are one thing. Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice taking on a dangerously sweet, condescending tone. "The character of our community is another. That contraption is not in keeping with the character of Summit Ridge. It's ugly, it's intrusive, and I can assure you it is negatively impacting the property values of your neighbors." She made a sharp, decisive mark on her clipboard. "You will be receiving a formal notice. I suggest you have it taken down before then. It will be much less unpleasant for everyone involved." She turned and marched away, leaving me standing in the quiet hum of my new life. The hum of my equipment in the cabin suddenly felt less like a sound of peace and more like a target. I had moved 1,000 miles to find a quiet corner of the world, only to discover that the front line of a new, petty war was my own backyard. And the enemy was a woman with a clipboard who had just declared my life's work, my nation's security, to be an eyesore. The first official volley in Marge's war against my antenna arrived via certified mail 3 days later. The envelope was thick and imposing. The letterhead embossed with the Summit Ridge logo, a stylized mountain peak that looked more like a shark's tooth. The document within was a formal citation, a masterpiece of bureaucratic aggression. It listed a fine of $200 for an unapproved structural addition antenna mast and another $100 for aesthetic blight exposed coaxial cabling. The citation was signed by Marge, her signature a flourish of sharp angles and self-importance. A handwritten addendum at the bottom read, "Failure to remove the offending structure within 10 business days will result in daily accruing fines and further disciplinary action by the board." I read the document not with anger, but with the detached analysis of a professional. This was her opening move, an attempt to establish a precedent of authority through paperwork. I knew that how I responded would set the tone for the entire engagement. A weak or emotional response would signal that I could be bullied. A defiant but unstructured response would paint me as an uncooperative crank. I needed to be calm, factual, and legally unassailable. I spent an hour that afternoon drafting my reply. It was not a letter from a homeowner. It was a correspondence that could have come from a legal department. I addressed it to the entire HOA board, not just Marge, ensuring there would be a record that all of them were officially notified. "Dear members of the Summit Ridge Architectural Review Board," it began. "I am in receipt of your citation, dated August 15th, 2025. Please be advised that the installation in question is in full compliance with all applicable local and federal regulations. Specifically, I draw your attention to the Federal Communications Commission's Over-the-Air Reception Devices, OTARD Rule 47C, F.R., Section 1.4000, which expressly limits the authority of homeowners associations to restrict the installation, maintenance, or use of antennas for amateur radio operations." I went on to cite the specific subsections, politely explaining that while an HOA could impose reasonable restrictions related to safety, it could not prohibit the installation outright, nor impose restrictions that impaired the signal quality. I stated that my antenna mast was professionally installed and grounded, posing no safety risk. As for the aesthetic blight, I noted that the single, black coaxial cable was run neatly along the base of a hedge and was minimally visible. I concluded the letter by stating that, as no valid bylaw had been violated and federal law protected my installation, I would not be paying the fines. I attached a copy of my FCC Advanced Class Amateur Radio license as an exhibit. I sent the letter via certified mail, return receipt requested. Then, I scanned the entire package, her citation, my response, the license, the mailing receipts, and emailed it to a secure, encrypted address with the subject line, Project Sentry Local Interference Log 2025-01. It was a formality, a just-in-case documentation for my real employers. This calm, legalistic response seemed to fuel Marge's fury more than any shouting match could have. She saw my appeal to federal law not as a statement of fact, but as a direct challenge to her sovereignty. The fines began to arrive with increasing frequency and creativity. I received a fine for the unnatural humming noise emanating from my guest cabin, a sound that was utterly inaudible from the property line. I received a fine for the excessive height of the antenna, even though it was well below the community's height limit for trees and flagpoles. She was no longer even pretending to adhere to the written bylaws. She was inventing violations out of thin air, fueled by a rage against the one resident she could not intimidate. For each new citation, my process was identical. A calm, formal, legally referenced letter of rebuttal to the board, a refusal to pay the illegitimate fine, a meticulous update to my digital log file. I was not just a homeowner defending his hobby. I was a senior analyst building a dataset on a hostile actor. I was documenting her every move, creating an unassailable record of her escalating, irrational behavior. The conflict felt absurd, like using a sledgehammer to kill a fly. But my training had taught me that no threat, no matter how seemingly insignificant, should be underestimated. Marge Thompson, in her own small way, was a threat actor. She was probing my defenses, testing for weaknesses, and my response, for now, was to be a gray rock, impassive, unmovable, and quietly recording everything for the inevitable moment when she would overplay her hand. The predictable escalation from paper-based harassment to physical action came on a Tuesday night. A storm had rolled through, lashing the neighborhood with wind and rain. The next morning, I went to my cabin to begin my daily routine of checking the signal integrity of my network. The main console, which normally displayed a series of stable, green waveforms, was a flat line. My connection was dead. A knot of ice formed in my stomach. This wasn't a system malfunction. My equipment had multiple redundancies. This was external. I put on a jacket and went outside, my eyes immediately tracing the path of the thick, black LMR 400 coaxial cable that ran from the base of the antenna mast to the entry port of the cabin. Halfway along its length, nestled in the damp mulch of a flower bed, I found the problem. The cable had been cut. It wasn't a frayed or storm-damaged break. It was a clean, perfect snip, as if from a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters. The copper core glinted in the morning light. This was a profound violation. It was an attack not just on my property, but on my function. For a moment, the quiet retiree vanished, and the man who had spent a lifetime safeguarding critical networks took over. My mind went into triage mode. Assess the damage, identify the point of failure, isolate the breach, re-establish the link, identify the perpetrator. The last point was the easiest. This was not the work of a random vandal. The cut was precise, targeting the single most critical and vulnerable point in my entire setup. It was an act of deliberate sabotage, and it had Marge Thompson's fingerprints all over it. A cold, professional fury settled over me. She had crossed a line. This was no longer a petty dispute. This was interference with a federally licensed communication system. More than that, though she could never know it, it was an attack on a piece of sensitive national infrastructure. My response was immediate and comprehensive. I spent the morning running a new, armored conduit for the replacement cable, burying it 6 inches underground. As I worked, I made a call to a secure number. "Director Evans, it's Alex Thorne." "Alex, A familiar, gravelly voice replied, "Everything all right. We registered a total signal loss from your node at 02:17 local time. Lasted for about 6 hours." "I'm aware," I said, my voice tight. The primary data line was physically severed. I'm implementing a hardened workaround now. Should be back online within the hour. But I need to request an upgrade to my perimeter security protocols. "An upgrade?" Evans asked, his voice sharpening with concern. "What kind of local interference are you dealing with?" "Let's just call it a highly motivated, non-state actor," I said. "I need a multi-spectrum surveillance package. Thermal, night vision, the works. I need to be able to monitor my entire perimeter, 24/7 with alerts tied to my private network." "Consider it done," Evans said without hesitation. "The hardware will be messengered to you by tomorrow. Alex, are you sure you're safe out there?" "The asset is secure, Director," I said, falling back on the old language. "I'm just enhancing its defenses." The next day, a nondescript package arrived. It did not contain the consumer-grade security cameras you could buy at a big box store. The equipment inside was military-grade, compact, and incredibly powerful. I spent the next 2 days installing the system, concealing the tiny, powerful lenses in ways no one would ever notice in a birdhouse. Behind a loose piece of tree bark, inside a fake sprinkler head. I configured the server, setting up a complex web of motion detection zones, object recognition filters, and instant alerts that would ping a secure device in my pocket if anything larger than a squirrel crossed my property line. In my mind, this was not installing cameras. It was deploying a counter-intrusion system. Marge had cut a wire. In response, I had turned my quiet suburban home into a miniature surveillance state, a digital fortress. She had wanted to blind me. Instead, she had just given me 1,000 new eyes. Having failed to disable me through direct action, Marge turned her attention to my reputation. Her new weapon was the Summit Ridge Community Watch, a private Facebook group that served as the neighborhood's digital town square. It was a place for lost dog announcements, complaints about garbage collection, and, under Marge's stewardship, a forum for her to wage a campaign of paranoid slander against me. Her opening post was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive insinuation. It began innocently enough. "Hi, neighbors. Has anyone else been experiencing strange interference with their TV reception or garage door openers lately?" Of course, a few of her loyal sycophants immediately chimed in. "Yes. Marge, my remote has been acting so funny this week." Marge then delivered the payload. "It's probably nothing, but I can't help but notice it started around the time our new neighbor on Chestnut Lane installed that enormous, bizarre antenna. I'm sure it's for a perfectly normal hobby. But with all the scary things you hear on the news about hacking and illegal broadcasts, it does make one wonder what's really going on in that strange, windowless little building he spends all his time in." The comment section exploded. The seed of paranoia she had planted sprouted into a forest of ugly speculation overnight. "I know who you mean. He's so secretive. Never comes to any of the neighborhood mixers. That building gives me the creeps. What does he have to hide in there? No windows." My brother-in-law works in IT, and he says antennas like that can be used to steal people's Wi-Fi passwords and credit card numbers right out of the air. Is he one of those conspiracy theory preppers or a spy? This is a neighborhood with children. Someone should call the police and have him investigated. I watched this unfold with a sense of clinical detachment, scrolling through the feed of libel and fear-mongering. I was being digitally ostracized, painted as a monster, a pervert, a foreign agent. The social chill was immediate. The few neighbors who had previously offered a wave now averted their eyes, hurrying inside if they saw me getting the mail. A woman walking her dog literally pulled her poodle to the other side of the street as I approached. My quiet sanctuary was being redefined as a villain's lair. I took screenshots of the entire thread, documenting every libelous comment, every false accusation. I compiled it into a PDF, encrypted it, and sent it to my log file. Project Sentry Local Interference Log, 2025-03. Campaign of public slander initiated. The isolation, while unpleasant, was also a tactical advantage. It meant no one would be dropping by unexpectedly. No one would be asking friendly questions. It allowed me to work with even greater focus, my attention fully on the hum of my equipment and the quiet flow of data from the outside world. One evening, while I was running a diagnostic on the regional power grid's SCADA system, a secure, encrypted call came through on my console. It was Director Evans. "Alex," he said, his voice unusually grave. "I'm not calling about the local interference. We have a developing situation. A new piece of malware, looks like a variant of the Triton family, has been detected probing the control systems of several hydroelectric facilities in the Pacific Northwest. It's sophisticated. It's designed to target industrial safety systems." My blood ran cold. The Triton malware was infamous, a digital weapon designed not just to disrupt, but to cause physical destruction by disabling the very systems that prevent industrial equipment from exploding or melting down. "Are the facilities air-gapped?" I asked, my fingers already flying across a keyboard, pulling up threat intelligence reports. "They're supposed to be," Evans said, "but we're seeing telemetry that suggests a breach. We need you to do a deep dive. From your end, you have a cleaner, non-attributable view of the network backbone. See if you can find the malware's command and control server. We need to know who we're dealing with." "Understood, Director," I said. "I'm on it." I spent the next 72 hours in a state of intense, unbroken focus, fueled by coffee and a cold sense of purpose. I was a digital ghost, moving silently through the deep channels of the internet, hunting for a predator. The petty dramas of Summit Ridge, the slander and the whispers, faded into meaningless background noise, while Marge Thompson was busy convincing her friends that I was a neighborhood menace. I was engaged in a silent, invisible battle to prevent a catastrophic failure of a major American utility, a disaster that could cost thousands of lives. The irony was profound. She was trying to turn me into a villain in a story of her own making, completely oblivious to the real-world monsters I was paid to keep at bay. Marge, emboldened by my public silence and convinced of her own righteousness, decided to bring in the full force of the federal government, or at least, the small part of it she understood. Having successfully painted me as a potential illegal broadcaster, she filed a formal complaint with the Federal Communications Commission's Enforcement Bureau. I knew it was coming. My new surveillance system had captured crystal-clear footage of her, clipboard in hand, meticulously photographing my antenna from the sidewalk, no doubt to submit as evidence for her complaint. 2 weeks later, a man in a crisp blue windbreaker with FCC embroidered on the chest arrived at my door. He was a field inspector named Martinez, and he had the weary, cynical look of a man who had seen every possible flavor of neighborhood squabble. "Alex Thorne," he asked, flashing his credentials. "That's me," I said. "Sir, I'm here to investigate a complaint of malicious interference and operation of an unlicensed broadcast transmitter at this location. The complaint alleges that your antenna is causing widespread disruption to electronic devices, and that you may be broadcasting on restricted frequencies." The complaint was filed by Marge Thompson. I presume I asked, my voice neutral. Martinez allowed himself a small, tired smile. I can't confirm the complainant's name, sir. But the complaint was detailed. Well, please, come in, I said, opening the door wider. I'd be happy to show you my station. It's in the guest cabin out back. I led him to the cabin, unlocked the biometric scanner with my thumb, and opened the heavy steel door. Martinez stepped inside and stopped dead, his eyes wide. He was clearly expecting a cluttered desk with some old, dusty ham radio equipment. What he saw was a miniature mission control. Racks of state-of-the-art servers hummed quietly. A bank of monitors displayed complex data streams and spectrum analysis charts. My transceiver, a top-of-the-line ICOM IC7851, sat on a pristine workbench, its dials glowing softly. Whoa, Martinez breathed, his professional cynicism melting away into genuine awe. This is quite a setup, Mr. Thorne. I take the hobby seriously, I said with a slight smile. I spent the next hour walking him through my station. I showed him my advanced class license, framed on the wall. I opened my digital logbooks, which meticulously detailed every single transmission I had ever made, showing them to be squarely within the authorized amateur radio bands. I demonstrated my grounding system, my surge protectors, my spectrum analyzers that showed my signal was clean, with no bleed-over or harmonics. Martinez was like a kid in a candy store. He was a radio enthusiast himself, and he recognized my setup for what it was, the work of a highly skilled and deeply passionate professional. Finally, he pulled out his own portable spectrum analyzer and did a full sweep of the property. He found nothing. No interference, no illegal broadcasts, no stray emissions. The only signals coming from my antenna were the clean, perfectly modulated Morse code signals I was using to talk to a fellow ham in Japan. Mr. Thorne, Martinez said, packing up his gear, a look of profound annoyance on his face. Your station is one of the most professional, well-shielded, and compliant operations I have ever had the pleasure of inspecting. The complaint filed against you is, to put it mildly, completely baseless. It's a frivolous and malicious abuse of the FCC's complaint process. He shook his head in disgust. I am going to file a report that will not only exonerate you completely, but will also flag the complainant's name in our system. If she files another complaint without merit, she could face fines for obstruction of commission activities. He handed me his card. If you have any more trouble, you call me directly. After he left, I watched his car drive away. Marge had tried to use the power of the federal government against me. She had brought in a federal inspector, hoping he would be her champion, the knight who would slay the dragon in her perfect suburban kingdom. Instead, that inspector had become my ally. Her attempt to weaponize the system had backfired spectacularly, creating an official federal record of her malice. This public failure, I knew, would not make her retreat. It would drive her to an act of even greater desperation, an act of pure, irrational entitlement. The final, decisive confrontation was not precipitated by a bylaw or a piece of technology, but by something far more elemental. Marge Thompson's towering sense of personal entitlement, her sister's family, I learned through the neighborhood grapevine, was coming for a 2-week visit over the holidays. Marge's house, while large, was apparently not large enough for her ego and her extended family. She confronted me one afternoon as I was bringing in my groceries. She didn't approach my door. She simply stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, as if holding a press conference. "Alex," she began, her tone a bizarre mixture of condescension and command. "I have a situation, and you are going to help me solve it." "Marge," I said, pausing with a bag of apples in my hand. I'm not sure what you're talking about. My sister, her husband, and their 3 children are arriving next week, she announced, as if this were a matter of national importance. My house will be bursting at the seams. It's completely unacceptable. She then turned and pointed a perfectly manicured finger at my guest cabin. You are a single man. You live alone in this enormous house. You never use that guest cabin for guests. It just sits there, empty, wasting space, humming with your weird machines. It is your community duty to make that space available for my family to use while they are here. I stared at her, genuinely stunned into silence for a moment by the sheer, breathtaking audacity of her demand. She wasn't asking. She was telling. She believed she had the right to commandeer my private property for her personal convenience. Marge, I said, my voice dangerously calm. I'm afraid that's not possible. The cabin is my office. It is not equipped to house guests. And it is not available. Her face, which had been set in a mask of regal expectation, contorted with rage. Not possible, she shrieked, her voice rising. It is a building with a roof. You will make it possible. I have been reading the bylaws. Alex, deeply. The HOA has the right to take action against any structure that falls into disuse, becomes a public nuisance, or is not being used for its designated purpose. That building is designated as an auxiliary dwelling unit, not your little clubhouse for nerds. This was a new level of delusion. She was twisting the language of the CC&Rs into something unrecognizable, creating a fantasy in which the HOA had the power of eminent domain over my outbuildings. That cabin is a nuisance, she continued, her voice now loud enough to draw the attention of neighbors, who began to peek out of their windows. It's ugly. It's windowless. You've filled it with God knows what, and you refuse to use it for its proper purpose. It is an underutilized community asset, and I am the president of this community. She took a step forward, her face flushed with fury. This is your final warning. You have 24 hours to clear out your electronic junk and prepare that cabin for my family. If you refuse, I will convene an emergency board meeting. We will declare the structure a persistent nuisance in violation of community standards, and we will take measures to repurpose it for community use. We will seize it. Alex, don't you dare test me. This was it. The final, insane escalation. She was threatening to physically seize my property. Not just any property, but a secure federal facility. A SCIF. The line had been crossed, obliterated, and left miles behind. I looked at her, at the raw, unhinged entitlement in her eyes, and I felt nothing but a cold, clear sense of finality. The game was over. The data set was complete. The hostile actor had finally committed to an act so far beyond the pale that the response would be absolute. I understand your position, Marge, I said, my voice utterly flat. I turned without another word, walked into my house, and closed the door. Then, I went into my office, activated a secure line, and made a single phone call. Director Evans, I said, it's Alex. We have an imminent, physical threat to the integrity of the Sentry node. I am officially requesting an immediate intervention from the nearest DHS field office. The threat is not sophisticated, but it is highly motivated and irrational. It's time. The following afternoon, the cul-de-sac was transformed into a theater of the absurd. Marge Thompson, true to her word, had arrived to lay siege to my cabin. She was not alone. She had brought 2 of her loyal board members, a man and a woman who looked deeply uncomfortable, and, for logistical support, a burly tow truck driver who was holding a large pair of bolt cutters, presumably for the biometric lock he had no hope of defeating. Marge stood on the edge of my lawn, a safe 10 feet from the invisible property line, and began to shout. Her voice was a shrill trumpet of indignation, intended for the entire neighborhood to hear. "This is your final notice, Alex Thorne," she bellowed, pointing at the silent, windowless cabin. "You have refused to comply with a direct order from the board. You have refused to act as a member of this community. We are now, under the authority of the Oakhaven Estates Covenants, officially repossessing this nuisance structure. The board has voted. This cabin will be used to house my family, and will then be converted into a proper community asset." Windows and doors up and down the street were opening. Neighbors, drawn by the commotion, were stepping onto their porches, their faces a mixture of curiosity and alarm. "Open this door now, or we will open it for you," she screamed, gesturing for the tow truck driver to approach. I stood on my front porch, watching the scene unfold with a preternatural calm. My phone was in my hand, but I wasn't recording. I was simply waiting. Then, it happened. Silently. From both ends of the quiet, looping street, two black, unmarked Chevrolet Suburbans appeared. They were immaculate, their tinted windows reflecting the placid suburban scene they were about to shatter. They didn't speed or squeal their tires. They moved with a silent, inexorable purpose, gliding to a halt and effectively sealing off the entire cul-de-sac. The doors opened in unison, and 4 men and 2 women in dark, professional suits emerged. They wore earpieces and moved with the fluid, economical grace of people for whom this was just another day at the office. The lead agent, a tall man with a square jaw and eyes that missed nothing, walked directly toward the source of the commotion. He ignored the gawking neighbors, bypassed the terrified-looking board members, and stopped directly in front of Marge Thompson. He flashed a badge. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm, polite, and carrying an absolute authority that Marge, in her wildest dreams of power, could never hope to achieve. "I am Special Agent Davies, Department of Homeland Security. You and your associates need to step away from this structure. Now." Marge was stunned into a momentary, sputtering silence. "DHS," she managed, her voice a squeak. "What is this about? I'm the president of the HOA." "He is the one," she shrieked, pointing at me. "Who is breaking the law?" Agent Davies didn't even glance in my direction. He spoke quietly into his wrist communicator. "Sentry, this is Eagle 1. Perimeter is secure. The asset is safe." He then turned his full, unnerving attention back to Marge. His voice dropped, becoming as cold and hard as polished granite. "Ma'am, let me be perfectly clear. This is not a guest cabin. You are attempting to gain unauthorized access to a secure federal communications facility. This entire property has been designated by the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency as a civilian auxiliary node for monitoring critical national infrastructure." A collective gasp went through the assembled neighbors. The tow truck driver dropped his bolt cutters with a loud clang on the asphalt. Davies continued, his words landing like hammer blows. "By cutting a federally protected armored data line on this property last week, and by conspiring to forcibly enter this structure today, you have not violated a neighborhood bylaw. You have committed several serious federal felonies. These include destruction of government property, conspiracy to tamper with a secure facility, and interference with the operations of a federal agent. We have you on video. We have you on audio. We have your entire digital history of harassment against a protected federal consultant." He gestured to the other agents, who were now quietly and efficiently separating Marge from her terrified cronies. "You wanted to know what was in the windowless building, Mrs. Thompson. You're about to find out, in a secure room, with a federal prosecutor. Now, you have the right to remain silent." Marge Thompson's face, once a mask of smug, righteous fury, had completely collapsed. It was a ruin of disbelief, of dawning horror, of the utter catastrophic realization that the silly little neighborhood war she had been fighting was, in fact, a federal crime. And she had just lost, in the most spectacular and life-altering way imaginable. The resolution was not a neighborhood affair. It was a federal one. Marge Thompson and the 2 board members who had accompanied her were taken into federal custody. The story that trickled out to the stunned residents of Summit Ridge was sanitized for public consumption, but no less shocking, a local HOA president had been arrested by Homeland Security for repeatedly targeting and attempting to seize what she thought was a neighbor's shed, but was, in fact, a sensitive government monitoring station. The local news ran with it for days, framing it as a bizarre cautionary tale of suburban power trips gone horribly wrong. The legal consequences for Marge were severe. Faced with irrefutable evidence, my meticulous logs, the FCC inspector's report, the high-resolution surveillance footage, and her own public threats, she was charged with multiple federal offenses. Her high-priced lawyers managed to negotiate a plea bargain that kept her out of prison, but the cost was immense. She received 5 years of federal probation, was forced to pay a 6-figure fine for the damages and the cost of the investigation, and was permanently barred from possessing a security clearance or serving in any position of public trust. Her family had to sell their home to cover the legal fees. Her life, as she knew it, was over. The Summit Ridge HOA was thrown into chaos. Investigated by the FBI for its corporate culpability in the harassment of a federal asset, the association was forced to dissolve and reform under a new charter with strict oversight. The culture of petty tyranny vanished overnight. My identity as a CISA consultant was never made public, but the message to the community was clear and absolute. I was to be left alone. The new neighbors who moved into Marge's old house were informed by their realtor in hushed tones that the quiet man on the corner with the strange antenna was involved with the government and was not to be disturbed. Ever. I finally had my peace. It was a peace forged in the crucible of a ridiculous conflict, but it was absolute. I spent my days in the quiet hum of my cabin, my noisy hobby once again a source of solace. I would sit before my bank of monitors, a silent guardian watching over the invisible streams of data that kept the country running, a protector hidden in plain sight. The greatest threat to my mission had turned out not to be a sophisticated foreign adversary, but the boundless, irrational entitlement of a woman with a clipboard. And in the end, the system designed to protect against the former had proven brutally, beautifully effective against the latter.